Welcome to the Online Great Books podcast, brought to you by OnlineGreatBooks.com, where we talk about the good life, the great books, great conversation, and great ideas. I'm Scott Hambrick.
And I'm Karl Shute.
Today, it's it's the 18th of June where we are. You guys are in the time machine. It's sometime in the future when you hear this. We're trying to get excited over here, guys, because today we're going to talk about Alasdair MacIntyre's book, After Virtue, which I am excited about. I don't know. I'm just having a hard time.
I don't know if you remember, future people, but in the middle of June in 2020, there's a lot of stuff going on. I saw something about how Americans are the most unhappy they've ever been in some poll. I believe it. There's been a lot of things going on. So, to come and do a podcast is difficult. On the other hand, all the things that are going on here in 2020 June, I can't do a darn thing about. And so this is part of the problem of the internet and the phones and everything. We're addicted to novelty. It's probably a feature of human beings, because if you're living and hunting and gathering, and then there's something new in your hunting and gathering area, you need to pay attention to it.
Yep. The
new predator or whatever. And so we're addicted to novelty, and we have these phones and internet that give us novelty. And so we're all up late at night following some developing story, and there's not a thing you can do about any of it.
I could read some books, maybe. You
could read some books, but there's not that much you can do. Certainly not within a news cycle. Okay? So I'm arguing with myself right now, dear listener. So when I say you, that's me. There's not much you can do about it in the near term.
I like how you don't get along with you.
I don't get along with me. I need some correction. I need to cheer up. Chesterton is my model in this.
Yeah.
Chesterton was always cheerful, always kind, and yet said what he thought, but never lost heart,
What a soul, that guy.
Yes, definitely. Definitely. So I'm going to cheer up, and we're going to talk about this book, After Virtue by Alasdair MacIntyre, which I think is a fantastic book. I think it is. I told Scott that if you want a vision of what I think a lot of what MacIntyre thinks. I got to meet him. He gave me a little help for my dissertation, which nobody has ever read, but I cited him in a footnote.
Should we read that on this show?
No, nobody needs to read my stuff. But he gave me a tip that helped, and so I got to put a citation in the dissertation, which said, this idea was suggested to me in personal conversation with Alasdair MacIntyre.
That's pretty cool.
That was neat. I got to see him give a talk at a seminar. So he's been around forever. Alasdair MacIntyre is Scottish in origin. He's an American now. He's been in America for a long, long time. I got to see him give a talk at a seminar I think it was on Christian universities, whether there could be any such thing. And I can't remember what he talked about. I do remember the beginning, though. He's talking about educational methods, and he says, when I was a lad, I was beaten if I did not know my Greek principal parts. And you may look at me and say, Alasdair, that's very sad. Well, I can read Sophocles, and you can't.
He's got a point.
Greek verbs have lots of principal parts. I think they have 6 of them.
Karl, I have an email I want to read.
Let's do the email.
Let's do this email here before we get into the good Dr. MacIntyre here. The subject line is not half-assed. And I think that this is a response to something that I said on the show that we did about Heinlein's book, Starship Troopers. And he starts off his email by quoting what I think was me. I haven't gone back and listened to that show after reading this email. I think I'm the one that said this. I said, our wars now sure do seem half-assed, don't they? And then he says, a generous listen to that. And I hear, because our wars now aren't as big as World War II, we don't have signed surrenders and our intentions shift, then we, in quotes, are just half-assing it right now. And then he says, from the tens of thousands of our men and women who have been killed and wounded over the 2 decades in a half dozen countries, killing people, etc., he tells me what to go do with myself.
It's not a pleasant thing.
No. And then I responded to him, and I'll paraphrase it, Karl, and then you can respond too. I'm not talking about the private soldier or even, colonel and down. I've never been in combat or even anywhere close to it. But for the folks that are pulling the trigger and having the trigger pulled on them, it's real. And I told him it's full-assed. It's real, and it's realer than anything that they've ever done or will ever do. I'm sure that their commitment is full. But we weren't talking about that. We were talking about the political prosecution of wars and the larger, strange strategic aims that our wars of the last 2 or 3 decades seem to have. Don't give people like our friend here that emailed me a chance for vindication and for victory. That's the part that I mourn. I told him here, I reckon you are a veteran of our conflicts. You've done well and you've done your best. Our politicians have not done their best for you. And that's what we're talking about. And that's what I was talking about. And I responded to him, and he sent me a very kind response back. He said he apologized for the pogo stick reference.
Well, now you revealed what he told you to do.
And I think we I think we're friends now. So I just wanted to say that, because if our friend here took the time to type that up and send that, there were probably others that thought it and didn't send it. I don't know. What do you got to say about such a thing, Karl?
I got 2 things to say about him. The first is just methodological. Anybody who says anything in public, there's this worry that you're going to say something wrong and that bad things might happen to you. So there's always that worry that maybe we did say something wrong. But I'm going to blame it on Scott. He said it.
That's fine.
But, the nature of reasonable discourse in a good culture, which is what we're going to talk about with MacIntyre, is that you can have a disagreement and you have ways to resolve the disagreement so that Scott and the gentleman can have a back and forth and come to some sort of rational understanding of what was meant, and you agree or you don't agree, but you have rules to the game. There's some way to figure it out. And that's what I hope anyone who's listening to this show thinks, that you think that there is such a thing as reason, that there is such a thing as truth, and you might disagree with me to the extent that I ever say what I really think. There's a mutual friend of ours that said that he listens to the show, and he thought, he said some nice things about it, and he says, well, I don't always agree, and I wrote him back, and I said, if you always agreed, it wouldn't be much of a show.
Karl said, I don't agree with me either.
I fight with me all the time, but you fight according to rules. And so we can have a conversation. Well, what did you mean by that? And you can even call somebody names and tell them to do something nasty with a pogo stick. And great. And then you respond, well, this is what I meant. And I appreciate the pogo stick reference, but I don't have one and I'm not interested. Whatever. I don't know. But you have rules by which you can resolve the conversation. I think that's really important. We're going to talk about that in MacIntyre's book in a minute. And the other thing is, my own opinions on all of this are, I have a friend who claimed he was a neocon, a young man. And I was like, really? What? I didn't know there were any. But I probably was one, 2001, 2002. I am not anymore. And probably thinking about it right now, the things that have changed my mind the most, I've never served in combat. God willing, I never will. But, I got a bunch of people that I follow that did, and I listen to them talk. And they're not interventionist, which makes me, less and less interventionist and more of I was telling Scott before we started, I might be turning into a pacifist.
Right.
And, for some value of pacifist, but that's what's happening to me as I'm getting older and older. It's very hard to convince me, well, this war will be the good one.
Right.
And those are my reasons. But if we agree on rules of the game, we can talk about it. And certainly we didn't mean what the writer of the letter, I think you said it anyway, but you didn't mean what he thought you meant.
No. There aren't any 19-year-old guys out there getting shot at. They're out there piddling around and playing Boy Scout and half-assing it. I understand that. And I'm sorry I misunderstood that. I'm sorry, maybe I didn't make that clear. But there's that. But I think we're friends now, you and I.
Well, I hope so.
Yeah, and then we had another email from a gentleman named Seth, and he said that he sure was interested in that reading list for the show, so he'd know what to do in the future. But,
we are too.
Yeah, Seth, I don't know if we're capable of it, but we'll put that vote down. So if you want to send an email, you can send it to podcast@onlinegreatbooks.com, and I'll certainly look at it, and then I might just delete it. Who knows? Who knows what I'll do? I don't know what I'll do.
So we were talking about MacIntyre. All right. He is still alive. He started off as a Marxist. So he talks about Marx a lot, but he isn't one anymore. And has had an interesting development, wrote Histories of Ethics. He does a historical study of ethics.
In this book.
In this book, in his work in general. I've read a bunch of it. I just bought another one today.
When are you going to read that?
I don't know. I'll listen to it in the car. The Amazon Kindle Voice app will be reading Alasdair MacIntyre, so that'll be fun. The claim in After Virtue is that ethical conversations about right and wrong, are currently pointless, unable to be resolved.
There you go. Irreconcilable, and the various sides have incommensurable arguments.
Right. We talk about reason, we talk about right and wrong, but we don't really mean it.
He kicks this. Is this guy a continental? What do you call this guy?
He's like an analytical continental.
Right. So he kicks the thing off with a little idea, it's not really the thesis of the book, it's the sub-thesis of the book, maybe. And he states it very clearly, but it's an analogy. Like, he tells you what the book is going to be about in an analogy. So I'm like, oh boy, here we go with this guy. This is what this is going to be like. And he says, imagine if there was some big calamity and we lost a bunch of our scientific knowledge, like a bunch of libraries burned, and then scientific equipment and equipment used in different technologies was damaged, and some of it was lost. And then later in the future, we found some books with burned edges. Some books are entirely missing. We have the second volume of, we have chemistry 201, but we don't have chemistry 101, and so on. When we started to talk about science again, we would have lost a great deal of vocabulary, a great deal of context, but our experience of talking about science would be just like the people who had a complete understanding of the science and technology before the loss. So he says our understanding of virtues is the same way. We've lost an enormous amount of vocabulary and metaphysical knowledge about virtue, but our experience of talking about virtue is like we know what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. But we don't.
Yeah, I want to explain this analogy a bit more. So there was a science fiction novel written, I believe, in the 50s by Walter Miller called A Canticle for Leibowitz. Influential for MacIntyre, influential for Walker Percy, and for me. And what happens in A Canticle for Leibowitz is it's set in the future. It is set after some sort of nuclear conflagration. And it is the adventures of the monks of the Abbey of St. Leibowitz the Engineer, who managed to preserve some blueprints. Only nobody in the monastery knows what they are, because the way MacIntyre puts it, widespread riots occur, laboratories are burnt down, physicists are lynched, books and instruments are destroyed. That's straight out of that novel. Mm-hmm. Everybody was so mad at the nuclear fire that they killed all the scientists. And so you just had a complete collapse of civilization. Well, in this monastery, this Benedictine monastery, they've preserved some of the stuff, but they have no idea what it is. And there's a passage where they've got blueprints, which, because of the manner of which you make a blueprint, it is dark blue with white lines. The way a blueprint is made is you shine light at something, and the places where the light is exposed, it changes color, and where it's not, it doesn't. So, but they don't even know that it's a blueprint, so they're doing illuminated versions of the blueprints, and they're spreading ink around very carefully to make the white lines. Because they don't realize that it's a blueprint, and they might as well just do it with dark lines on a white background. But they think there's something important in the way the blueprint is. They have no idea. It's a really suggestive story, and I'm sure it got in his mind. So we talk about right and wrong, just like future dystopians might talk about mass and energy. Mm-hmm. Mass and energy would be like spell words that ancient wizards used to go to the moon.
That's a pretty big claim that he makes there, right in chapter 1, and then he goes on to spend chapters 2 through 14 showing how he's probably right about that. And here's how I know that he's right about it. As I was reading that, I realized that I didn't understand what virtue is well enough, and I had a feeling of great loss as I read this.
Think about this. So we'll talk about, in the endless debates that we have nowadays, we will talk about something as being the right thing to do or the good thing to do. What does that mean? What is the good?
I've led some Meno seminars, Plato's the Meno. And it starts off with the question, can virtue be taught? And then, of course, you have to say, well, what is virtue? And then later you have to say, what is teaching or what is learning? But we've asked that question, what is virtue, in the seminars, and nobody can ever answer it.
Well, they could, but they don't have the framework in which to answer it. So I was looking for a prop. I don't have a knife handy. Yeah, I do. Here's one.
They can't see it. Just pretend like you have it.
Here's my knife. It's a little, it was in Tennessee back when we used to be able to travel and do things. And it's like a railroad spike, a tiny nail that has been hammered into a knife. Mm. And I picked it up just because it was neat. Whoever did it twisted the end, makes a nice handle. You can sharpen pencils with it. I need to sharpen it. And the reason I need to sharpen it is because right now I'm pushing right down on the blade and it's not cutting at all. It is not a very good knife at the moment. See, there we can use the word good. And we know what it means, right? What is a good knife?
Something that cuts real nice, holds an edge, and is safe for the user.
Mm-hmm. Those are among its qualities. Holds an edge. Probably you could put some size in there, depending on what you're going to use it for. Mm-hmm. But do you see what's the basis of all of those good qualities of a knife is some idea of what the function of a knife is. To sharpen my pencils or to cut paper or to, I was going to go hunting. I was going to go be a hunter and I never saw a mammal, but I have the knife. The one to gut the kill.
Yeah.
Well, that has to be a bigger size because it has a different function. It has a hook on it, which I suppose you use when you're doing that. I've never done it. But it's really easy to figure out the virtues of a knife because you know the function of a knife. You can figure out the virtues of a computer. What makes a good computer? Well, you know the function of it. What are you going to do with it? And then you can figure out all the virtues of it. Of a musical instrument, same thing. You can figure out what's it supposed to sound like. Now, transfer that to the human being.
So if we wanted to know what virtue was for a human, then we would need to know, according to you, what the purpose or the use of the human was.
Yes.
Huh. Well, that's just to have a good time and buy shit, right?
Well, I don't know, but that would be something. If that were the case, then you would know what the virtues would be.
Right, we'd at least know something, yeah.
Yeah, but what we don't do, and MacIntyre traces this to late Middle Ages, Renaissance, Jansenists, and the Lutherans and such. We have gotten rid of, see, some of you, if you're alert and listening, some of you have probably already perked up and said, well, who are you to say what the function of a human being is?
Well, we didn't say.
Well, we didn't say, but we said suppose.
Right.
That's the sticking point. To talk about the function of the human being seems to be an imposition on your freedom of self-determination. Mm-hmm. But, gosh, if you don't have a function for a human being, then what in the heck are you supposed to do?
Well, let's go back to this. Moral injunctions or calls for particular virtues are perceived by the hearer nowadays as a restriction on their freedom.
Yes.
Seems right.
Right. So there's a line later in the book where he talks about politics a little bit and how this is writing in 1980 that the conservatives and liberals, conservatives are just a little bit slower at being completely individualist. Mm-hmm. You know, they're all liberals. Liberals in the sense of the focus on individual freedom as the good.
Right.
Everybody's that. But it turns out to be, in my opinion, and this is a big book for me, this is an important book for me, I read it in grad school, it blew my mind, is it just doesn't make any sense. You can't usefully say that anything's good unless you know good for what.
Seems right.
And obvious. And it takes him, 360 pages to do it.
In the first part of this book, he makes this argument about like this canticle for Leibowitz, sort of an argument about the loss of the vocabulary, bedrock principles that you need to know something about virtue. Then he goes on to characterize what current arguments about virtue are like or how they're conducted. The point that you already made from him, I guess, is that anything that is said from one opposing person to the other in a debate about virtue is perceived by the other as an attempt to just strictly control that. At this point, all arguments about virtue boil down to, because that's the way I want you to act. Or at least that's the way they're perceived by the various camps in the debates. Popularly, right?
Yeah, if we were to talk about equality and equity, one of my former students on Facebook posted something about that. If person A argues, I should be able to just do what I want. I'm not hurting anybody. I'm living my life and making my money, and you shouldn't just be able to take it because I got it fairly.
Right.
And the other person says, but there are inequities in the world that need to be solved, and therefore we need a high tax rate on those of you that are earning. All right. Well, how do you resolve that disagreement?
Alasdair says in chapter 17 that those are sort of the basic formulations of what justice is, what you just put out there. And he calls them A and B. And so A and B here both think that they know what justice is. So the other person is saying that justice is something entirely different.
Yeah, and it's irresolvable.
Yeah, and it's even worse than that. If I hold view A and say A is justice, and you go, no, B is justice, then it naturally follows that I think that you want to perpetrate an injustice. It's not that we just don't agree. It's that we have an irreconcilable notion of what justice is, and you're fitting to bring injustice to me and the ones I care about. It's not just incommensurable and unsolvable. It's a recipe for utter disaster.
Yeah, but if it were solvable, if both of the competing parties, and this is kind of a thumbnail sketch of Rawls and Nozick, two guys that wrote in the 70s about justice. Nozick is, I guess, a libertarian, and Rawls is a typical modern-day political liberal.
Nozick wrote his Anarchy, State, and Utopia, I think is where most of that is spelled out, and then Rawls'
Theory of
Justice, which we need to read, Karl.
Yeah, we probably do. I've read some of it. It's really long. Do we have to read the whole thing?
Please no. Somebody tell us what the juicy bits are.
So you end up equity versus, if I got stuff that I earned through, as Nozick says, a just act of acquisition, although that's begging the question a little bit, how do you resolve that with, there's poverty that shouldn't be there? You can't unless you resolve it by recourse to some higher order view. And this is exactly what MacIntyre says we don't have. We don't have a vision of what a human ought to be. Or, and here's the thing where it gets interesting, and a big struggle for me when I was a young, tending libertarian grad student, virtues don't make any sense outside of a community. So these questions of justice, like Nozick will say, justly acquired. We could read some of that book too.
Yeah, we need to.
But justly acquired where? In what community?
My oldest one's reading Anarchy, State, and Utopia right now. She said, I can only read 2 pages at a time. I was like, yeah, I know. Yeah, see, you said that these virtues only make sense in a community, and I agree with that, and I think he makes just as Aristotle does, he makes a good argument for why that's the case. I know right now that somebody is thinking what I had once thought was, but what do you mean? Of course, thrift and cleanliness and so on counts when you're not in a community. If you were Robinson Crusoe, good hygiene, because we've got this weird, it's all broken. All of our talk about virtue is just utterly broken. I've got over here, actually I just boxed it up. I boxed up a copy of this Bill Bennett Book of Virtues, which is a nice thing, but they're not real virtues. Come at me. I mean, they're just not real virtues.
Heartwarming stories.
And MacIntyre talks about Ben Franklin's utilitarian style virtues, which are just those kinds of things. Promptness, cleanliness, thrift, industry, those sorts of things.
What does he say about venery?
Venery. It should only be used for creating children. But then he says, venery should never be used.
Franklin's pretty open on his licentiousness on that question. I'd have to look it up, but use venery only occasionally.
Right.
Which is not really a virtue, is it? It's like steal only occasionally.
Right. Venery.
Venery, the pursuit of Venus, I think, or something like that.
I'm trying to find it.
It's a euphemism, a way to talk about things that you don't really want to mention. Franklin had a lot of girlfriends.
Yeah.
He had a lot of children that were not with his wife.
Weird dude.
He took care of his children, not with his wife, but nevertheless. Yeah, a weird dude.
Who I love.
I want to just read a little bit of MacIntyre's writing so you can see what he's all about. This is way back in
81.
Chapter 1, page 2 for me. What is the point of constructing this imaginary world inhabited by fictitious pseudoscientists and real genuine philosophy? The hypothesis which I wish to advance is that in the actual world which we inhabit, the language of morality is in the same state of grave disorder as the language of natural science in the imaginary world which I described. What we possess, if this view is true, are the fragments of a conceptual scheme, parts which now lack those contexts from which their significance derived. We possess indeed simulacra of morality. We continue to use many of the key expressions, but we have very largely, if not entirely, lost our comprehension, both theoretical and practical, of morality. Yeah, he's a bit long-winded.
Oh, subordinate clauses.
Yeah, you'll be a good reader if you make it through this.
Yeah, I've got a good friend who is in my home book group, and he and I go eat lunch on about every other Thursday. He and I have argued until I'm bored with it, and he is too, by the way, about what the difference between morality and virtue is, or morality and ethics are, to the point that we're just bored with it. We've just come to a halt. So we've got these words: virtue, ethics, morality, virtuousness, ethicalness, morality. We got these three words, but nobody knows what the heck they mean. And and if somebody goes to Merriam-Webster.com and copies and pastes the definitions and sends them to me, I'm not going to read it, because in practice nobody knows what those words actually mean.
If you join Online Great Books and get your complimentary membership at the Oxford English Dictionary and send him those definitions, he will read it.
Well, I've looked, but the thing about dictionaries, this is interesting to me, they document usages, right? Which doesn't mean that the words actually mean anything or that the words are valid.
Yeah, it's not a conceptual dictionary.
No.
It's a usage dictionary.
Right.
Like literally, which now means figuratively.
Right.
How do you say literally if you actually want to mean literally?
Especially, right. Now, how do we, we've had that word stolen from us, so now I have to clarify when I talk about, I read this and the book literally says X, Y, Z. I have to actually clarify. I mean, the words actually spell out the newspeak.
So chapter 2, the nature of moral disagreement is, this would be evidence that he's right. I love in the prologue, he says, if there are any reasons why the central claims of this book are incorrect, I certainly should have heard of them by now.
He's so salty. He's really funny.
He is very funny. If you get a chance to see him talk, he is very funny. It's just, it might be 3 days before you realize he told a joke.
Yeah.
And then you'll laugh. So in the beginning of chapter 2, the most striking feature of the debates in which these disagreements are expressed is their interminable character. There seems no rational way of securing moral agreement in our culture. And he gives 3 examples, a debate about war, a debate about abortion rights, and then a debate about equal outcomes, equal opportunity, that sort of thing. But those debates have been going on forever. The arguments about war, in the first example, premises which invoke justice and innocence are at odds with premises which invoke success and survival. You have conflicting reasons that cannot be resolved because you don't have any way to resolve them. Which is more important, justice and innocence or success and survival? We talked about that with Alinsky, so we were, most of us, 3 of us, kind of horrified at Alinsky's tactics in Rules for Radicals. But if you lose...
You can take your horror to the grave with you, can't you?
Well, what's more important? You need a higher level concept. You need a higher level way to resolve questions of justice and innocence and success and survival.
And the people of the Greek polis, they would have shared that shared vocabulary, those shared concepts, those higher claims, and then they could all get on the same page, or at least they had a lot better chance of it.
Yeah, he gave a good example of what this sort of thing does in an intact culture and a non-intact culture. King Henry II and Thomas Becket, and then Henry VIII and Thomas More, 2 Thomases, 2 Henrys. It's parallel. So Henry II was trying to usurp some of the rights of the church in, I think, the 1200s or 1100s, whenever this happened. And Thomas Becket, who had been his friend, and according to the movie, his drinking buddy, resisted it. He did what archbishops of Canterbury did in those days, which is fight for the rights of their organization. Well, Henry II says in an unguarded moment, "Who will rid me of this meddlesome priest?" And 4 of his barons go, and I think it's Christmas Eve, they go and they kill Thomas Becket in the cathedral. Henry then has to do penance, and he ends up at the tomb of his friend, naked from the waist up, being whipped by the monks. Thomas wins, even though he dies, but they were both playing the same game. There was accepted rules. You know, we're fighting for the rights of one, the rights of the other, but they both are within a tradition, which was the Christian tradition of Western Europe at that time, of England at that time. Well, Henry VIII and Thomas More, there's none of that. You know, Thomas More becomes not useful to Henry VIII. He has this one line, which I really love. He says something about, you shouldn't tell a king what he can do. You should tell him what he should do. He was the Chancellor of England for Henry VIII. Well, he wouldn't sign the Oath of Succession, or whatever it is, the Oath of Supremacy, the one that made Henry VIII the head of the Church of England. He wouldn't do it. He didn't make a big deal out of it. He wouldn't do it. But Henry VIII says, you have to sign. He wouldn't do it. And so he ends up killed on the scaffold, head chopped off. And Henry VIII never does any penance ever. There's 2 different worlds now. There's the world of the total power of the king, and then there's the world that Thomas More inhabits, which is more like Becket's world. But the 2 worlds have drifted apart. They're not playing the same game anymore.
Yep. Well, there is no game, Karl. There are these individuals.
Well, if there's no game, there's no right and wrong.
Individuals pursuing their self-interest, and you determine what's virtuous by whether it serves your rational self-interest.
Rational self-interest doesn't have any ends.
What? So I can eat Cheetos and play video games.
A syllogism does not have moral force.
Right.
A bare fact. There's no such thing, says he. This is another shocking thing to young grad student me. He says there's no such things as natural rights.
Ooh. He calls natural rights and utility pseudo-concepts.
Well, I was on board with him for utility. Natural rights was a bit of a struggle for me to think of that.
Yeah. You know, he said just because some framer wrote that we have these inalienable rights doesn't make it so, and that they've never been able to conclusively, no one's ever been able to conclusively show that we have natural rights. He doesn't really even try to disclaim it. He's just like, they can't prove it. You just assume it. But the fact of it is, rights, whatever they are alienated all the time.
Well, and they don't make any sense. What does the Declaration say? Don't tell me to sit on a pogo stick, anybody out there. The Declaration says, we hold these truths to be self-evident. Right? What self-evidence would mean is that you could sit in your philosopher's armchair, which he talks about at some point in the book, and just look at the proposition that you have a inalienable right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those 3 big ones from the Declaration. Yeah. And that you would consider the terms of this statement, I have a right to life, and that somehow you would be utterly convinced of the truth of this, in the way that you would be convinced that the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees.
People have been trying to do this, right? Rand tries to do it.
Rand tries to do it. I don't think I like lots of her stuff, but I think she failed on it.
Yeah. And so the key point that you make there is like, is it a deadlock? Angles of the triangle equal 180 degrees, and it's not. just because they say, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Declaring that doesn't mean it's so, and there aren't any proofs for it.
How do you prove that somebody has a right to life? If you can do it, I would appreciate you sending me the proof.
Yeah, and they're going to send, people are going to send these sort of Randian sort of proofs and all that. And I get it, man. I've bought them and loved them. They're going to see some, I don't know, von Mises or Rothbard or something. I don't know. Walter Block. And these arguments that derive from self-ownership. But not everybody can agree. It's not self-evident. Not everybody agrees on that, regardless of cultural context, time, spot in history, and so on. But if you do say to yourself, okay, we have certain unalienable rights, and here is a list of 3 of those, and it is not an exhaustive list, and then you start to try to build a system of virtues that you'd like your society to operate on so that they don't kill each other, it's awfully squishy already.
Mm-hmm. Now, how could you do it? Well, what you could do is say, this is what a human being is. And when you say is, you're going to contain in that is, just like I did with the knife. This is a knife, which means it ought to be a certain way. This is a human being. A human being ought to be a certain way. A human being ought to be a member of a community with a function. A father, a mother, a guardian. You situate the individual within the community. Now you can say, if you want to use rights language, it's connected to duties. Rights without duties are, Jeremy Bentham says, rights are nonsense, natural rights are nonsense on stilts. It's a funny line. Rights without duties are like farting in a hurricane. If you can't discharge duties, you don't have rights. So the rights would grow out of, well, if I am a father and my function is to provide for my family, that this is what makes me a good example of what I am, you might be able to say that you have rights to the things that you need to make this happen.
You might be able to.
I don't know that you want to use the rights language anyway. You might just say, this is what fathers do.
Should.
Yeah, should.
Should.
Ought.
Oh, no. We're going to get some ises from that?
For ises and oughts, we're not going to get through anywhere near like 20% of this book.
This book's so juicy.
Just go read it. Art of Manliness has a nice digest of it, by the way. They put out an article on it, so which you can find, which I recommend if you don't want to read.
Brett has read this 3 or 4 times. It's a big book for him as well. We talked about him coming on the show. I talked to him about coming on this, and he did it with us, but we just couldn't get it to happen. He busted me up a few places. He's hard on Aristotle.
Who, Brett or Alasdair?
Alasdair MacIntyre. He's really hard on Aristotle. That's how you know he's good. Like his favorite's Aristotle, and he says he's wrong in the following ways.
Mm-hmm.
And then he tries to put forth a system of virtues that fixes those, I think, 3 shortcomings that he points out for Aristotle. We can talk about those. And then when he deuces on natural rights, I wasn't ready for that. I think it'd be good, Pod, if I read this kind of 3 paragraphs here about this on natural rights. I think this is going to be something that would trip people up and maybe make them either not want to read this or want to read it.
Where is this?
It's on page 69. He says, once we have understood it, it's possible to understand also the key place that 3 other concepts have in the distinctly modern moral scheme, that of rights, that of protest, and that of unmasking. By rights, I do not mean those rights conferred by positive law or custom on specified classes of person. I mean those rights which are alleged to belong to human beings as such, and which are cited as a reason for holding that people ought not to be interfered with in the pursuit of life, liberty, and happiness. They are the rights which were spoken of in the 18th century as natural rights, or as the rights of man. Characteristically, in that century, they were defined negatively, precisely as rights not to be interfered with. But sometimes in that century, and much more often in our own positive rights, rights to due process, to education, or to employment are examples, are added to that list. The expression human rights is now commoner than either of the 18th century expressions, but whether negative or positive, and however named, they're supposed to attach equally to all individuals, whatever their sex, race, religion, talents, or deserts, and to provide a ground for a variety of particular moral stances. It would, of course, be a little odd that there should be such rights attaching to human beings simply qua human beings in light of the fact, which I alluded to in my discussion of Gebworth's argument that there is no expression in any ancient or medieval language correctly translated by our expression, a right, until near the close of the Middle Ages. The concept lacks any means of expression in Hebrew, Greek, Latin, or Arabic, classical or medieval, before about 1400, let alone in English, or in Japanese, even as late as the 19th century, mid-19th century. From this, it does not, of course, follow that there are no natural or human rights. It only follows that no one could have known that there were. And this at least raises certain questions. But we do not need to be distracted into answering them, for the truth is plain. There are no such rights, and belief in them is one with belief in witches and unicorns. The best reason for asserting so bluntly that there are no such rights is indeed of precisely the same type as the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no witches, and the best reason which we possess for asserting that there are no unicorns. Every attempt to give good reasons for believing that there are such rights has failed. The 18th century philosophical defenders of natural rights sometimes suggest that the assertions which state that men possess them are self-evident truths, but we know that there are no self-evident truths. 20th century moral philosophers sometimes appealed to their and our intuitions, but one of the things that we ought to have learned from the history of moral philosophy is that the introduction of the word intuition by a moral philosopher is always a signal that something has gone badly wrong with an argument.
Yeah, you stopped one sentence short of where I would have stopped. In the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights of 1949, what has since become the normal UN practice of not giving good reasons for any assertions whatsoever is followed with great rigor. See, there's that joke. You're going to read it, and then 3 days later, you're going to say, my gosh, that was really funny.
Yeah, he says, the existence of such rights cannot be demonstrated, but remarks on this point simply that it does not follow from the fact that a statement cannot be demonstrated that is not true, which is true, but could equally be used to defend claims about unicorns and witches. Now, he's being flippant here, and throwing that unicorns and witches thing in there is kind of fun. And it was a bucket of ice water on me for a bit, and I had to go walk around the block a couple times, and I think he's right.
So what does it mean that he's right?
It means that everything that we've done in our political system is a failed system, and that we're getting our desserts.
Why? Is something happening now?
I don't know.
I don't really want to talk about that.
If you try to build a political system around the idea that there are witches and unicorns, and there aren't any witches and unicorns, you're just off the mark. And let me be skeptical. Let me just say, maybe he's kind of right. Maybe we just don't really know what the exact natural rights really are supposed to be. We have the wrong list of them. And if we, just like they didn't have the word for natural rights or human rights in the 1400s, once we develop that vocabulary, we'll be thunderstruck and be able to burst into some utopian era of clean and good living.
We need to invent the moral language,
right,
in which these concepts can be expressed. Moral claims do not make sense outside of a tradition, a community. If I'm a member of this community, a religious, the Eastern Catholics of Illinois, there aren't very many of us, the Byzantine Catholics of Illinois, that there are things that are right and wrong within that community, understands as right or wrong. And then when we understand what we mean when we say right, what we mean when we say right is, so there is a state of you that where you are right now. Then there is a state of what you ought to be. And then the virtues make sense because they're the way to get from state A to state B.
I listen to you, and I've read MacIntyre, and I'm a whole lot like you in terms of how I view all of this. But I can't hardly shake off that emotivism, where I bristle up at you saying right. It feels like you want me to act a certain way because it suits you.
Mm-hmm.
I feel like somebody's trying to control me. This book is hard to read for the very reason that he points out in chapter 1, which is I lack the vocabulary in the context for talking about virtue in a rational way. And then our moral philosophy has been just completely subverted by emotivism, where everything is an emotional argument, where everything becomes Rawls wanting you to act the way Rawls wants you to act. Nozick wanting you to leave him the hell alone because Nozick likes it that way.
Yeah.
Although I think Nozick makes better arguments than Rawls, as best I can tell. It's still emotivist.
Let's talk about what emotivism is. So emotivism is kind of 20th century thing.
Yuck.
Which, hey, that's the century I was born in.
Yeah.
What moral utterances really are, they're not statements of truth at all. So if you say murder is wrong, you're not actually saying anything about the property of that action, which is a murder. What you are saying is, murder, yuck. I don't like it.
Right.
That this is really what morality is, that it is an expression of preferences. And you may think you're talking about truth, but you're not.
It's about preferences.
It's not what I think when I say right and wrong and good. I think I actually mean something by them. But imagine if emotivism was true, which it seems like a guiding. It's the way a lot of us are emotivists. It reflexively.
I am sometimes.
It's in the air.
Right.
It's in the air. I would have those first days in an ethics class, and I think ethics classes are probably about the most useless thing in the world, but I had to teach them. And on the first day, we would just talk about just the bare notion of what the word happiness might mean. I would get so much pushback. Well, it's whatever you want it to be. That's emotivism. That right and wrong is whatever I want it to be.
Whatever feels good, bro.
And if that's the case, then moral argument can't proceed because argument is based on reason and facts that we can hold to be true. Emotions are like flavors of ice cream. Okay? Vanilla is the best ice cream. Do you like vanilla the best? Pretend you don't, like some other one.
I do not. It's butter pecan.
No, you're wrong. You do not like butter pecan. You, in fact, like vanilla.
I actually believe this about pumpkin pie. Nobody likes pumpkin pie.
If I say I like pumpkin pie, you're going to argue with me and say, no, you really don't.
I'm going to say, no, you really don't. You associate that gross gourd puree with grandma's hugs and good times and nostalgia. So you're like Pavlov's dog. You taste that gross gourd. You think of a time gone by when you were young and happier, and that's what you like about pumpkin pie. And the reason I know that you don't like pumpkin pie is because you've never ordered one at a diner on July 17th.
In fact, I haven't.
That's why. See, I'm right.
Well, you might be right, but you had to go and do some psychology for that. But just a bare accounting of flavors. There's no accounting for taste.
Right.
And if all morality is an expression of taste, then there can never be moral argument. We ought to quit doing them. And so when you consider the way that in which, think back to the Alinsky book. He didn't care a whit about whether his tactics were right or wrong. He cared about whether they worked to get the things that he liked.
Utility.
Yeah. If morality is simply the expression of your own emotional states, then there's no rules to this game. There's no arguments. There's no point in walking up to protesters who are on the different side from you and attempting to have a conversation. The only thing that you can do is defeat them. Yep. So I ask you, dear listener, does that not sound to you like political debates in the 20th and 21st centuries?
Yeah, and political debates at this point don't even try to convince. It's just people signaling to those who already agree with them who you are so that you can rally them behind you.
Oh, yeah.
There's no attempt to convince or persuade. Now, you said that you can find out what's right and wrong in your cultural or community context.
Yeah.
Sounds awfully relativist.
It does sound awfully relativist.
So is there no absolute virtuous behavior?
Well, how would we solve that problem? And MacIntyre doesn't really give you an answer.
No.
At the end, he's like something like Aristotle or St. Benedict, which is an intriguing thought.
Oh, boy. He says that you should be able to, let me see if I can remember this without looking at my notes, that you should be able to figure out what's virtuous by, that those virtuous actions would have to fit your purpose. Like actions for a father, properly done, I think almost anybody would agree with this. I think. Of course, the world's gone mad. But it seems to me like people would know that the proper way to act for a father is entirely different than that of a 10-year-old girl. They have different purposes, and I think that those two different purposes would mean that they need to take different kinds of actions. So you got to know what your purpose is. There you go. Teleology. And then you have to take intelligible action. Whatever you do has to make sense to somebody looking at it, if they have enough of the context.
Mm-hmm. And your community needs to be able to deal with challenges to itself.
Right.
Okay. And if those things are true, then it might be not a horrible way for humans to live. In other words, it's closer to whatever the truth is. And truth would be, I think the way out of this is an understanding of human nature. And this is something MacIntyre does in some later books, is like dependent rational animals. What is actually a human being? So if the culture that you're in matches up pretty well with what the human being actually is, then you might have a good working out of how to be human. I want to go back. So if you look at the Iliad, we have competing claims in the book. This is a spoiler if you haven't read it, but it's been 3,000 years. You know, there's no spoilers for 3,000-year-old books. Well, 2,800-year-old books. Agamemnon in the beginning, Agamemnon and Achilles speak muse of the cause which caused them to stand apart and fight. You know, well, Agamemnon has one view of honor. Honor is the accumulation of wealth. Wealth meaning, you know, gold and humans and whatever, all of that stuff. You pile it up, and the one with the most stuff is the most honored. Achilles has a different view of honor. Honor is the virtue, the glory of the individual soldier. They have two competing claims. Are they able to work it out within the heroic tradition? I don't think they do. Mm-mm. That's why I think the Iliad's a subversive book, at least to the heroic tradition. The way MacIntyre puts it when he talks about the Iliad is, what Homer shows you is that sometimes you lose when you win. So Achilles wins and loses.
Like Beckett.
Yeah, Beckett in reverse. So you could see some friction in that heroic age, that particular culture. Nobody ever says, Achilles, you're doing wrong. They don't ever bring up words like morality and rights and anything. None of that. Nobody ever does that. They make appeals to the way soldiers act. Like Ajax in the end of Book 9 of the Iliad says, come on, Achilles, all this over a girl? Anyone else would have taken the money. So Ajax is saying, if you were, you know, another not very self-reflective soldier like me, Ajax is great, you would have taken it. You know, and Phoenix makes a similar appeal. You should do this before it's too late. You'll end up doing it anyway. But it's all within the structure of the heroic age. So there's some tension in there. That heroic age is not able to deal with the challenges that are coming to it. That management issue that shows up in Book 1 of the Iliad. Mm. So maybe it's not quite right.
Their ethics, which is that of the hero of the heroic age, does not equip them for anything new.
Yeah. And you could probably make similar discussions about the Odyssey. Ideals of kingship. What happens when your king's gone for 20 years? You know, it's a situation which the culture of Ithaca was not prepared to deal with and does not deal with well. And then the goddess has to come and make everybody happy at the end.
Well, can't you just legislate about that and get it all cleared up?
Legislate on what basis?
Right. I mean, you can legislate on it, but if the community doesn't agree on the basis for that legislature, there will be conflict. That's what we're saying.
Yeah. So community's really important. This was a challenging thought to me, you know, young individualist grad student reading Nozick, you know, and dark corners of my grad school.
Did you have to hide where you went to school to read Nozick?
No, they were all right. It was a good program. At the time, I don't know what it's like now.
It was a long time ago, Karl.
It was like 2000. That's 20 years ago. That's when I finished. So, in other words, not all cultural responses to the problem of being human are equal. And there are ways to figure it out. When these challenges arise, are there ways to deal with it? I'll give you an example. So, gosh, this book is so thick, so full of good stuff. MacIntyre has marvelous takedowns of another favorite of mine, Kierkegaard. Kierkegaard is a complete individualist and Well, anyway, so Kierkegaard has this crisis of faith. It's a long story. You need to know Kierkegaard's biography if you're going to read his stuff. He was going to marry this girl, and then he just couldn't make himself do it. He comes up with ideas of faith as being an absolute leap across an abyss, and he gets more and more isolated, and writes nasty things about the Lutheran Church of Denmark, many of which are likely true. And you read his book, Fear and Trembling, a very challenging, wonderful book on what faith is, which I don't think is quite right. Because what I want to do is I want to say, hey, Soren, because Soren was isolated, as I say, Soren, what you need is a community of believers who would say to you, you're going off the deep end. Come to the fish fry on Friday, hang out with he was Lutheran, but hang out with the Knights of Columbus at the fish fry, get some human contact, realize that religion is not a project done in your garret in Copenhagen in an isolated way. It's done in a community, and go be part of it. So he didn't use the tools that were available to him. This is my quick reading of Kierkegaard's life. But, can they deal with it? Did you give them a chance? Rather than thundering denunciations on Danish Lutherans, did you give them a chance to solve the problems that you had?
Now somebody's listening to this and saying, well, if he can't make whatever faith leap is required to be part of their community, how can they resolve that for him?
I don't know. This is getting into Kierkegaard. I think his vision of faith, if we ever read that book, I don't think it's right. I want to be kind to him. I just keep saying, I want to say it's wrong. Right. Say, Soren, you're wrong. But it's such a good book. It's wrong in such an interesting way. But he was so isolated. He didn't take part in a community. He has no way by putting himself on the outside, there's no way to resolve the problems that he had. That's my reading. Somebody will write in and say, I got it wrong, but bring it.
Yeah.
So something more of an Aristotelian style would work better than liberal individualism, which completely isolates you from a community. You have no way of knowing what's right and wrong. By default, it makes emotivism seem right.
If you're, I almost said empathy. Let me see if I can think of a different word. Yeah, if you're not in a community, there's no possibility of you understanding how your actions would affect others, or how theirs affect you. You would mouth a lot of stuff about victimless crimes. Yeah, and there's no check and balance at all.
You wouldn't have a firm idea of your function. And if you don't have that, you don't have morality. And then emotivism seems true. Let me give an example. I feel like I'm talking too much on this podcast.
Yeah, that's all right.
But our usual practice of sending our young people off to college for 4 years, currently that's not working here in the middle of 2020 because everything's closed. So future people, if it's back again, consider this. So you take your young people.
I say it would work less well if it wasn't closed. So there.
So they've grown up in a community with family and friends and family friends and their church, wherever they, if they do any of that, wherever they do that. And then right at the cusp of adulthood, in the old days, it would be adulthood.
Mm-hmm.
Say, and go 5 hours away, live in a dorm, be away from your people, be rootless. Like that song, I Got No Roots. That song breaks me up a bit more than it probably should. No roots, no function, no community. What is right and wrong then? I don't know. It's whatever I feel. It's whatever somebody at the college is able to convince me.
Don't judge me, bro. You don't know me.
We're rootless. And if you are rootless, we are communityless. That's what I mean by that. We don't have strong communities. You don't have a strong idea of what right and wrong is.
Yeah, communities seem to make us happier, don't they? It seems to help. It seems to matter.
Yeah, I think it matters. I think it's crucial because right and wrong for what? For a human in this community. That's where the words make sense. We were talking earlier about different traditions. Which ones are, I don't think they're all equal. I think some do a better job than others. But it's only within the community that you even know what your role is.
I have some problems with this.
Yes, tell me. Bring it on.
Well, I already mentioned it's relativistic. I mean, there's no absolute, like, this is virtue here for MacIntyre.
I don't think it's relativistic. I just think it's not easy.
Well, virtue for him would be relative to wherever the heck you were and what role you were in. He doesn't have that, like, Sartre conception of role and all that, defining who you are. But I don't know. Maybe you could clean it up if you could say that man, meaning Homo sapiens, has a single telos, single purpose. Mm-hmm. If you could say that Bantu, Cossack, Cherokee, and G.K. Chesterton all share the same telos, then you can clean it up. But if that's the case, does the community part of his argument, is that necessary? I don't know.
So this would be a bit like Augustine's City of God. The telos, if there is one, telos means the end, the goal, the final cause, is as a citizen of the divine city. Mm-hmm. So there would be, even there, it's described as being in a community.
Sure. You're back to your religion thing.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry. I don't mean to. Well, yeah, I do. Where else are you going to go?
Yeah, if there isn't some sort of a transcendent purpose like that, then you won't be able to have a universal ethic.
Right.
I don't see how you could.
Yeah, and this is the project they tried in the Enlightenment. Okay, so They broke the bonds of rationality and religion. This is a real quick thumbnail MacIntyrean sketch of the Protestant Reformation and the Jansenism and the Catholics. If human nature is depraved, I think is the word.
Depraved. Totally depraved, or some maybe 50% depraved. In what way are you able to use human reason to discover right and wrong? You can't. And so you don't have this idea of grace building on nature anymore. The link gets broken. Well, in the Enlightenment, they pretty much got rid of the Protestantism. So we don't have any links to the tradition. Can you get morality simply from reflecting on reason? And it didn't work. Kant and Hume fail. Kant's answers all end up to be what good Lutherans in Königsberg would do. Yeah.
Just coincidentally.
Yeah, he can't escape that.
But pure reason, I mean, Kant is trying to ground it in pure reason, but it's divorced from any conception of happiness.
Oh, has there ever been a more joyless person than Immanuel Kant? Go look for like an engraving of him, like his face. Physiognomy doesn't lie, man. What a miserable SOB.
I don't know. He lives in my head. I think a lot in terms of stuff that he wrote, but it's not fun.
So there's one of the things that bugs me about this. And then me being an American, I'm a utopian, you know? It seems like if we could just write up the right political documents and if we could just expose the correct truth about the way for people to interact, we would all just thrive and everything would be great. I think he acknowledges that can't be so because he says that a good set of virtues would allow the community to deal with new challenges. I don't know. I'm a utopian. I want to just say, golly, if we can just find the right Bill of Rights, if we can just get another amendment in there, then we're just going to clean all of this up. Mm-hmm. But it doesn't work that way, clearly. I mean, we've put several dozen amendments on the end of this thing, and it's just not getting cleaner.
Well, the reason I said ethics classes are useless is because nobody becomes ethical from an ethics class.
Right.
What's the point? So we're going to learn about Kantianism and deontology and utilitarianism and all sorts of conceptual ways when if you're not already good, it won't make you good. Aristotle says in a very MacIntyrean passage that if you don't have good habits, there's no point in studying ethics because you won't have the starting points. Mm-hmm. Habits make all the difference, I think is the direct quote. So, and the habits are, what are the habits? The habits are of being, when he was writing, of being whatever a good Athenian is, but a good Athenian gentleman. If you didn't have that, then it wouldn't do any good to talk about the virtues that make a good Athenian gentleman.
Right.
Because you have no stake in it. You don't care.
Blowing it out your butt. And this is the level of Benjamin Franklin's virtue, by the way. He's like, here are the things you need to do to be a successful gentleman tradesman in a Quaker community in Pennsylvania. Early to bed, early to rise, stitch and time saves 9, a penny saved is a penny earned, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
But it doesn't tell you what to do at 4 p.m. on a Tuesday, that old problem, right? I like that Bill Bennett wrote the Book of Virtues, and I love the autobiography of Benjamin Franklin. But that's not the whole story, is it?
Yeah. Did you catch the line about it might be perhaps that the road to heaven is not the same as the road to success in Philadelphia?
Yes, I did. He's so funny.
That's another joke. Maybe we ought to give the conclusion, because there's so much good stuff in here about bureaucracy and therapy and emotivism and why emotivism popped up when it did and who did it, and all sorts of good stuff. You learn a lot about history of philosophy from this.
Yeah, this is a great synopsis of the history of ethics. It was really slow reading for me because I wasn't familiar with so much of the stuff he was talking about in here. There was a lot of new vocabulary for me, and I read many, many paragraphs more than once. It was a tough go.
Yeah, I want to do the last paragraph. I'm going to mispronounce the word. I never quite knew how to say it.
It's good.
It's always dangerous to draw too precise parallels between one historical period and another, and among the most misleading of such parallels are those which have been drawn between our own age in Europe and North America and the epoch in which the Roman Empire declined into the Dark Ages. Nonetheless, certain parallels there are. A crucial turning point in that earlier history occurred when men and women of goodwill turned aside from the task of shoring up the Roman imperium and ceased to identify the continuation of civility and moral community with the maintenance of that imperium. What they set themselves to achieve instead, often not recognizing fully what they were doing, was the construction of new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained, so that both morality and civility might survive the coming ages of barbarism and darkness. If my account of our moral condition is correct, we ought also to conclude that for some time now we too have reached that turning point. What matters at this stage is the construction of local forms of community within which civility and the intellectual and moral life can be sustained through the new dark ages which are already upon us. And if the tradition of the virtues was able to survive the horrors of the last dark ages, we're not entirely without grounds for hope. This time, however, the barbarians are not waiting beyond the frontiers. They've already been governing us for quite some time. And it is our lack of consciousness of this that constitutes part of our predicament. We are waiting not for a Godot, that's the word I never knew how to pronounce, but for another, doubtless very different Saint Benedict. Okay, so that's an example. So we ought to talk a bit about Saint Benedict. He was living in the 5th century Rome. This is the time when Rome, which was the capital of the world, had ceased to be so. There were wolves in the streets. The population was 1/10 of what it was before. If you read in early times about all those pillar saints, the ones that lived on pillars, and you think, where'd they get the pillar? No, the pillars were there. They were just the pillars of the lost civilization. And the saint would go climb up on the pillar and live there for 30 years. I saw a picture of one. There was one in Athens before they cleaned up the Parthenon for tourists. There was still a monk living up there. So what Benedict did is he left town. It was no longer possible to be the sort of human he thought he had to be in Rome. So he went off into the hills. People followed him. And so he established a community. You can read his rule. It's a community designed to do what he says here, new forms of community within which the moral life could be sustained. But it's not the big community. It wasn't Rome. He couldn't do anything about Rome, but he could go off in the hills to Monte Cassino.
Yeah, there's a lot to like. We ought to read the Rule of St. Benedict's big long thing, too. We ought to read that, though. There's a lot to recommend it. He just sets forth a bunch of rules about how a group of people should live together. And there are people that still live by that rule and read a piece of it out loud to each other every day and strive their best to live along that shared set of rules.
Who's more influential, Benedict or Marx?
Benedict.
Yeah, probably.
Benedict created the West.
Yeah.
I think.
Well, we wouldn't have any of the books but for the monasteries.
Yeah.
That's one of the things they did was keep the tradition alive.
I mean, the Benedictines, or the people that lived along the Benedictine tradition, are communist. Marx, I don't know if he's explicitly borrowing or stealing or whatever, but they're communist. You know, the monks down the road from me over here, they don't own anything.
Yes, but the doors open out.
Well, that's true.
And that's what the rule says. You can leave, you can come back, and you can leave and you come back. If you leave 3 times, we're not letting you come back.
Right.
But it has, so it is an interesting thing to look at. There are tools for conflict resolution in the rule. The rule's for a bunch of religious guys, and if you don't follow the religion, there'll be a bunch of it that you don't think you want to do.
It's still a really interesting experiment, though, for a guy to sit down. It's more pointed than like the Republic, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's specifically a rule book, a school handbook, or whatever for how to get along.
Well, and this passage is good for me. So this is something that I read, and I read it, 1996? Probably read it the first time. It's a real challenging book, challenged a bunch of my thoughts. But this ending about, well, what are you going to do? You cannot impose a new community with new sets of morals from the top down. It wouldn't happen. All you could ever do would be from the bottom up. So the community thing's important to me, and dare I say, to the extent that we've managed it, Online Gradebooks is kind of one of these examples. I would hope.
Yeah, I think so.
A place in which, at least the intellectual life, we don't live together, so I don't know about the moral life, but the intellectual life can be sustained where you can read books and talk about them with people who share some presuppositions with you, namely that there is such a thing as truth and that it's worth talking about, and finding that there's more of them out there.
Yeah.
I don't know what other forms this will take. People are going to do it. People are going to find ways to live together.
Hope so.
I hope so too. But what shapes would they take? I mean, Rod Dreher wrote a whole book on this. What does he call it? The Benedict Project? Something like that.
I don't know that one.
On this idea of creating communities where you can live the good life.
One of the key things that I have taken from this is that all of our various stances on justice and virtue, and, well, justice is a virtue, but all our various stances on these virtues are incommensurable and irreconcilable. Period. He convinced me of that. I already experienced it, you know? I've talked to people about stuff.
Mm-hmm.
I already knew that was true, but then he tells me precisely why that is true, and I buy that.
Let's sum up. The reason why it's true is because you have no notion of the telos of a human being.
That's right.
If you don't have an idea of what human beings are supposed to be like, then there's no point arguing about anything.
Yeah. So we don't agree on what a highest good is. We don't agree on what the telos is. And something that Pasquarella says to me, we also don't agree on what the worst thing is. We were talking about COVID one time in Slack. I think it was me, you, and John Pasquarella. And John says, maybe COVID is deadly, but dying's not the worst thing that can happen.
Mm-hmm.
We don't need to make decisions based on that being the worst thing that could potentially happen. Yeah, being poor isn't the worst thing that can happen. Somebody may listen and say, well, you're not poor. It's easy for you to say. Well, there's a whole lot of other shit I'd rather not be than poor. We don't agree on a purpose, and then I will add to that. We don't agree on what's the highest good because we don't know what the purpose is. And then we don't know what's bad. We don't even know what bad is. We can't even agree on that. So we can never get together. And if that's the case, then the project has failed. The Imperium is broken, like he says. And your only hope then is to find your community that has, or create your community that has commensurable, ethical, and virtuous goals.
Yeah. I want to give a more hopeful spin.
By the way, I don't think that's not hopeful, Karl.
Yeah, I don't know. It's 2020, and I hope the future is bright and cheery, and you're all looking back. Why are they so sad? But I think you read Aristotle, you read Plato, I got accused of deucing on the Stoics. Read the Stoics, read all of this stuff, read the best of what human beings have come up with, and get a better idea of what a good human being is.
Yeah.
And then maybe there can be some consensus in friendship. 2 popes ago, it was very big on this concept of solidarity. John Paul II. Solidarity is friendship within the various levels of society, like real Aristotelian friendship. It's a wonderful concept. That would be nice. I would like some of that.
Mm-hmm. We have that, Karl.
I'm not so sure.
You and I?
Oh, us? Oh, I thought you meant we in the big sense.
Oh, you almost broke my heart.
No. That's not what I meant. I meant like from the coasts to the middle to have friendship throughout the community. But friendship being everybody having a common vision or a reasonably common vision of what's good and then working for it.
Yeah.
Like the third kind, Aristotle talks of 3 kinds of friendship. The third kind is the real kind. The friendships of utility or passion are not so real. But the friendship based on the good is. Oh, there's so much in this book. MacIntyre is a bottomless well of insight.
Is this a great book, Karl?
Is it a great book? Does it have to be? It's pretty good. It's one of the more important 20th century philosophy books, I think.
A lot of people are saying, well, why haven't I ever heard of it?
If they were philosophers, they would have heard of it. Yeah. Why haven't you heard of it? Because it's really hard.
It's really hard. Charity said, I was finishing this up last night. We were sitting on the back porch. Weather was glorious. And she said, what are you reading? I said, big kid book. It's a big kid book, man. It's a big kid book.
If you're going to tackle it, I go ahead and do it.
Heck yeah.
Don't do it on a schedule where you got a podcast about it in a week.
Oh, what a nightmare. I had to punt because I couldn't get it done. I'm pretty steadfast on my reading schedule. I couldn't do it. I don't think it's a great book, Karl. It's a really important book. I think everything that you said about it's true, but I don't think it makes the canon. It's mostly derivative and an apology for Aristotle with a little dressing on top, which I think is really awesome. But, 500 years from now, are people going to be wrestling over this one?
What it is you go to the doctor for tests. Here's your diagnosis.
Yeah.
That's what this book is. It's diagnostic. Like, there's so many good things in it. When he talks about Nietzsche, who's another friend, my friend Friedrich, and he makes a point. He's really good on the diagnosis, not so great on the solutions. Yep. Which is something that you could probably say about the book. The solutions are hard because how can you even dictate what a future community that doesn't have these flaws would be like? So we look back to Aquinas and Aristotle. Well, we're not going to remake them completely. It's not 5th century Athens. Can't do it. 4th century Athens.
He talks about Nietzsche as one of the few philosophers that had the nards to point out the failings of philosophical language in addressing these problems. Dead on.
Mm-hmm.
If you want a crash course in ethics, I think this guy is great. He makes wonderful steelman arguments for everybody's case. He does a wonderful job. He says, here's my view. It's not quite as straightforward as Aquinas, but he says, here's my view, and here's how everybody would disagree with it, and here's why they're sad. He's a little pompous, but he does it in a very fun way, I think.
In person, he's funny.
Yeah,
he is funny. He loves Jane Austen.
Loves Jane Austen.
Isn't that what all the heroines of Jane Austen are doing? They're trying to build a form of community which the more life could be sustained. They do it through marriage, but that's what they're trying to do. There's so much good virtue theory in Jane Austen. Yeah, I think it's really good. I think if you're going to read it out there, go ahead and grab it. Say, I'm going to do chapter 1.
Yeah, spend 7 months on it. You know, I think it'd be worth that. He says, Jane Austen is the last great effective imaginative voice of the tradition of thought about and practice of the virtues, which I have tried to identify. It's high praise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I'm glad I read it, but I'm even more glad that I finished it and I don't have to read it again for a while. But I will come back to this. McKay said he's read it 3 times. How many times have you read it?
3 or 4.
Yeah, I'll come back to it. There's a lot here.
Yeah, and, I went through all my notes. I had 450 highlighted passages.
Did you not read it a 5th time?
No, I read it. I read it again, but this morning I went through all of my notes.
Okay.
Flashcard style.
We barely just sniffed this book on this podcast.
Yeah, so if you go out there and you see people shouting at each other and there's no possible way that anybody can come to an intellectual agreement, this is why. So it gives you the why for the frustrating nature of modern debates, and it gives a little bit of a direction on where you might go.
Yeah, and it's a little frustrating because he doesn't say step 1, step 2, step 3, utopia. But he can't because he doesn't know your community.
That's true. And how do you know which community's vision of the good is the best?
Well, you just have to pick one. You have to pick a community and commit to it, right?
Mm-hmm. I don't think we're quite as helpless as it seems to be in this book. I mean, he's proposing Aristotle and St. Thomas. He's got a dog in the fight. It's going to depend on your vision of human nature. Mm-hmm. But, picking one and living in it would be a good start, rather than being a rootless modern person.
Yeah, and when I say pick one and commit to it, I don't mean take a map and throw a dart at it and then move to Detroit and say, this is my community. I mean, we need to go farther than that in the way we select. But you have to use some sort of criteria. I don't know. I've got some ideas, but once you're in there, you got to do it. These utopia is just not possible. There will be conflict. If you're let's say, just for example, I don't think either of us believe this, but if we said the exact right way to live would be by the rule of Benedict. That's it. The exact rule. Well, let's say that just for the sake of argument, that's the perfect way to live. It's by the rule of Benedict. Mm-hmm. Still going to be conflict. It's not perfect. You'll have bad days. You'll be mad as hell at Friar so-and-so or whatever, They're not friars in Benedict. But you'll be mad, and stuff won't go great all the time. It's okay. It's okay, and you have to just stay with it because, the human condition isn't perfect. Can't be. Never can be.
You can also have paralysis by analysis. I'm not sure of the correct way to live. I don't know which community would be the best one to be in. Therefore, I'm going to sit outside of all of them and play video games.
Right.
Look, you're going to get older. Your life is going to happen to you no matter what you do. Finding the best one that you can right now is a good start.
Yeah.
Might as well get on it and see if you can figure out what the good life is.
Yeah, a lot of our communities at this point have been disintegrated, just been destroyed. There's going to have to be some creation of communities out of whole cloth for everybody to find a place.
Yeah, well, we got one here at Online Great Books. If you'd like to get on the waiting list.
Yeah, that's true. You can go to onlinegreatbooks.com/podcast and jump on the waiting list. We'll be open enrollment again here. I don't know exactly when this is going out. 4, 5, 6 weeks from today, we'll be open enrollment again, and you can jump on there. And we do have a bit of a community. We certainly have one when we do seminar on Slack and so on, but we also have people that care about each other and kind of take care of each other. And when they're in town, they drop by and share a steak and so on. We had a lady that had a stroke and had trouble reading, and the people in her seminar would call her and read to her. That seems virtuous. That seems to be something that arose out of a genuine community that took intelligible action in order to fulfill a ultimate purpose. Like that, I don't think I can say anything else without getting real contemporary and political.
Yeah, we don't want to do that.
I'm tired of it.
Yeah, it's LARPing.
Yeah, it is. Next week, we're going to be reading The Storm of Steel by one Ernst Junger. We're going to read the original 1929 translation. I think you do too, the Mystery Grove Publishing Company edition that we both got from Bezos. That's going to be interesting.
I'm about 3/4 of the way through it. It's World War I.
The beginning of the end.
That's a huge event. And if you didn't learn about it in school, and it's not huge because of any strategic outcome, it's huge because of what humans were thrown into. But I should probably ought to save it for the pod.
Yeah. Yeah. Oof. So we've read some anti-war stuff. We read some just war stuff. Is that Heinlein? Was the Heinlein book just war stuff?
I don't know.
I think he was trying to describe, just conflict, and I don't know. Butler is pretty much anti-war. at least in War is a Racket. I can imagine sitting down with him and having a cup of coffee and him describing war that would be just and proper and just prosecution of such a thing. And then the Junger thing is a little bit different animal, so it's going to be interesting. Have you read All's Quiet on the Western Front?
Long time ago.
Yeah, I've read that 3 or 4 times, and the Junger book is not that one, is it?
No, not so far. I'll let you know. I've got to get to the end.
They're quite different. So go read that if you're reading along with us. It's so interesting how our readings just kind of follow these threads, you know? It's one of the reasons I don't want to create a list, is because we kind of do a dive on a theme for 4, 5, 6 months and then switch to another one.
Well, you got to put Canticle for Leibowitz on the list somewhere.
I did. I typed it down here a while ago.
Oh, good.
Yeah. It's going to be good. Well, there's another Online Great Books podcast. Go to onlinegreatbooks.com/podcast and go sign up for our little list there. We'll send you our newsletter. We'll send you some white papers. You can maybe get in and be part of the community. You know, we've got some goodies we're selling because I'm trying to get the darn thing to make enough money that I don't have to cut its throat. So you can go to our shop and you can go buy the Andreas Nodiger World History Timeline, which we're the only people in the world that have it, and it's the best thing that you've ever seen. It's this like 6-foot-long poster. Did you get yours, Karl?
I did. I have to figure out how to laminate it.
Yeah, it's a 6-foot-long
You mentioned
poster.
Kinkos, and I don't know that there are any Kinkos anymore.
They're FedEx now. FedEx, Kinko.
Yeah.
It's just this timeline that organizes all these technological, religious, political events in a big, long chronology. It's got maps on it. It's got so much information on it. It's awesome.
I have a book that does that goes year by year through all of history, saying everything that happened, but you can't visualize it.
Right. The visualization's pretty cool.
Yeah.
And then there was an old weird book that I wanted an audio edition of, and I couldn't find it. So I recorded one. There you go. And that's in our shop, too. You can go get some weird Oswald Spinkler Man and Technics. If you just haven't had enough of my voice, you can go and get that. Oh, anything else we want to plug, Karl? I don't know.
I think that's enough.
That's enough. Well, thank you guys so much for listening. Pick up the Junger book, and we'll read that together. We'll talk about that together next week. And do tackle the MacIntyre book if it has some sort of religious overtones, at least if you've picked up that it has religious overtones from Karl and I, know that it doesn't. I don't think it really does. It's under there. We know that MacIntyre is a Catholic fellow, and it's under there, but it's not overtly that, and I think that there's a lot to be learned from it, no matter where you are on this thing.
Right. Yeah, when I say religion, you can substitute community.
Right.
Morals don't make sense outside of a community.
There you go. Well, thank you guys so much, and we will talk to you in 7 days.